Donald Wandrei, 1908 to 1987. Nightmare. The night had grown gloomy, and the air moved with the moans of an arising storm. But blacker than that darkness and more sinister than the wind that arose from the west was the house that stood before him. He knew it was deserted, and that for years it had been unoccupied, just as he knew that his journey's end lay in one of its rooms. He was alone, and the house waited malignantly. The moans of the wind arose ever higher, and a fearful apprehension steadily grew through the forest all around. The cypresses were shivering, and the sly shape peered malevolently from a corner of the house. The restlessness of terror stirred within the forest to the moaning of the wind, the low-flying clouds above, and the gloom that had become horribly alive. He looked again at the black house. He knew not whether to enter or to pass on and return in the day, but there were no habitations in all that lonely and desolated realm, save the old house. What he sought lay within, with the guardian. And the sly shape was becoming bolder around the corner of the house, and the night grew ever more sinister as the wind changed its moaning to a louder tone that went rising to a howl. The night was black, and the forest, black the sky, the wind, and the old house itself. Yet he walked through all that blackness to the house, for the treasure lay within, and the guardian might not be expecting him, unless the sly shape got back to warn the thing it served. He tried once or twice to catch the sly shape, but it ran back of the house and mocked him with a ghastly, ghoulish tittering. He could not pursue it far, for the decayed one and the innumerable fingers of pallid flesh and all the other servants of the guardian were near. And so he left the sly shape and cautiously walked to the entrance of the house. The hinges of its door had long been rusted, together with the lock. Only a push was needed to open the door, but before giving it, he paused again to look around. The moaning of the wind came ever higher, and all had become so gloomy that he saw nothing save the oppressive darkness. As he pushed open the door and stepped through, he heard far away, above the sound of the wind, the distant howling of some animal. When he had passed the portal, it ceased abruptly. The hall he had entered was silent and dark. There met his glance, when he flashed a light around him, only the empty hall, with dust everywhere. But a head rolled from a door on the right, grinning at him for a moment, and rolled out of sight across the hall before he could fire at it. He knew now that the guardian would be warned, but he decided to go on since he had come thus far. Besides, if ever fear obtained the supremacy in his mind, he was lost. The servants of the guardian would pour upon him in a rush, and so he searched the hall again. He saw then at the far end of the hall a stairway that began on the right, went up a few steps, and turned. He thought for a moment. The guardian was not likely to be on the ground floor because that was too accessible. He must go upstairs to seek the guardian and the treasure. He listened again. Somewhere in the rear of the house, he heard a dull bumping for a few seconds. He thought it must be the head thudding up a rear stairway to warn its master. The wind was howling around the house, but avoided entering it, so that all within was still. He walked down the hall toward the stairway, glancing as he passed into the dark room from which the head had rolled. Innumerable burning eyes gazed covetously on him from within, and in mid-air a great clawing arm reached toward him out of the darkness. He walked on without looking back, though there came from behind the pattering of many steps. Oddly enough, the dust on the floor where the head had rolled remained unbroken. When he reached the stairway, he immediately began the ascent. The moment his foot touched the first step, his mind became a lair of the blackest and most unutterable horror, a horror that crawled through his veins and filled his entire body. And at every step he took upward, the horror in his brain thickened and deepened hellishly. He knew then that the guardian was above and waiting. But he had to pause a moment, for his legs had grown suddenly heavy when the horror came upon him. He gazed at his foot. A great, fat thing clung to one heel. He reached down to beat it off, but with incredible speed it leaped aside and fled. When it fled, the weight on his mind lessened a little, and he began to climb again. But there seized him all at once the fancy that the entire upper floor was filled with corpses from some awful charnel, so that he must stumble through them all to reach the guardian. And ever, as he climbed, the horror grew and grew upon him. But he staggered doggedly upward, trying to shut his mind to the intruders. He lifted his legs drearily and monotonously, until even this maddened him, and he rushed up the last few steps. He stood before an ancient oblong hall that had 9 shut doors. Behind one of them lay the treasure and the guardian. He knew not which was the right door, and hesitated a moment. But hesitation meant fear, and fear meant... He began to walk down the hall, past the doors on the left, but he had taken only the first step when there forced itself into his mind the thought that a wan thing kept pace with him in his rear. And at every step he took down the hall, his belief became more and more a knowledge that the wan thing followed him and drew closer. As he passed the first door, images of nameless things came pouring horde on horde into his mind. The guardian was aroused, and all its legions were emptied into the corridors and chambers of the house. Phantoms wandered into his mind at will, nor could he stop them. The cohorts of death, pale and ghastly, thronged into his thoughts and would not leave, but ever increased. Abominations of countless kinds arose in his vision, so that he could see and think only of the loathsome servants of the guardian. The house, which had been still, became filled with sound, but the sounds all were terrible and indescribable, a faint, rushing patter as of rats running through the walls, a low gurgle like that of one who drowned, a dull pat, 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 as if a great toad passed down the hall below, a sibilance far away that yet filled the hall with a husky whispering. And always as he walked on, the images came crowding thicker, and the sounds grew more unnatural, so that in his mind was the ever-changing course of the phantoms, in his ears the ceaseless sounds of all things damned. He knew that the wan thing behind followed closer and grew more bold. He knew that the sounds were beginning to wash in his mind in measure with the welling of the phantoms. He knew that the guardian, in a desperate attempt to drive him back, mad or afraid, was calling in its servants from everywhere, and sending them, except for those that kept watch over the treasure, to attack the invader, each in its own fiendish way. As he passed the second door, he stumbled, He recovered himself quickly, but stumbled again, and though his brain was weakening under the strain that continually increased, he shook aside for a moment the black mists which thickened before his eyes and glanced at the floor. He leaped from his path and instantly was jumping and twisting from side to side in a frantic endeavor to evade those bloated things. There were not many at first, and for a few seconds he avoided them. But they rose upon the floor with an awful rapidity. They rose like huge purple mushrooms, instantly, as if the very dust upon the floor quickened into life. They waited for him where they rose. For a time he avoided them and kept on, but they became so thick that when he was no more than halfway to the third door, he stepped on one, and though it sank under his foot, when he went on it remained fastened to his heel, growing fatly as if it fed. He stopped, and in a kind of panic tried to shake it off. Almost instantaneously the floor beneath him was crowded with the things which fastened to him like monstrous leeches. He battered and beat them, but they multiplied so rapidly that he stopped and staggered on. And ever the horror grew upon him as he passed toward the third door, blotting out of his mind all save the occupants it brought. His feet dragged heavy and leaden. His mind tottered under a mighty blackness that throttled it and pressed it down. His entire body struggled against the attack of the massed legions of the Guardian. And when he reached the third door, he knew that what he had sought so long was within. He knew that the treasure and the Guardian awaited, for through the closed door emanated an utter malignance, an utter evil that swept upon him in a sea of hatred and malevolence, until it seemed that about him surged a blackness of things nameless and indescribable that ravened for him, that filled the hall with innumerable gloating, low whispers. For one moment he stood before the door, as if in doubt. But the awful tide surged upon him, and all the servants of the Guardian poured out in a last overwhelming rush. Then, with the bloated things on the floor creeping toward him, with the whispers rising into a husky mocking, with a horde of phantoms crowding rank on rank into his mind, with an unbearable darkness falling heavily upon him, and with the knowledge that the Guardian and its greatest servants waited within, he hurled himself blindly forward and burst open the door to the room. 1965.